Salutations, tubers. Welcome back to the layout room, and here we'll be doing the second part of our little series on steam locomotive wheel arrangements. This time around we'll be covering the wheel arrangements that have 6 driving wheels. The last one had engines that have 4. So I guess without further ado, we'll get started. First off, we have the 060. These particular engines are both 060Ts. If you'll remember from last time, T denotes tank, so the locomotive carries its water in water tanks and carries its fuel on a fuel bunker instead of having a separate tender on. And this one is an 060ST. As with the little 040s, these things tended to be used for switching service and light road work. Some of the bigger 060 engines that had tenders on them, particularly over in Britain, tended to be kind of maids of all work, like the 4F, several other designs. But don't have any 060 tender engines yet, but one of these days I kind of hope to find one. Another commonality they share with the little 040s is these things tend to be kind of unstable at speed because the wheelbase is so short. So it tends to rollick and roll, and you can't run them at high rates of speed because you don't have the lead truck. These kind of tended to be favored in later years over the 040s because you have more tractive effort and you've got all the weight pressing down on all the wheels, so a little bit more powerful. But that being said, there were some places where even these couldn't fit, so you had the little 040s. And like the little 040s, there were railroads that used 060s as primary road power, like little branch lines here in the States. I know one railroad in the Southeast, little mining railroad, primarily hauled coal. Their entire fleet was made up of 060 tender engines because that's all it could fit, and that's all they needed. Kind of a classic little design. Okay, next up we have the 260 called the Mogul. This is an approximation of a British Mogul that I made. Kind of a little kit bash job. But the Moguls were kind of maids of all work. You'd find them working on passenger and freight work. Another classic design. Some of you might be wondering why I'm showing a British engine instead of an American one. For some of my wheel arrangements, some of the wheel arrangements I have in my collection, I don't have the American version of it, but I do have the British one because I collect British locomotives, so gotta kind of make do and mend. But yeah, another very popular engine for branch line work and small railroad work. Those of you who might play the Railroader PC game, actually one of the first locomotives that you get gratis when you start the new railroad is a little Mogul. Good little engine. Okay, next up we have the 262, the Prairie type. Kind of a more modern style locomotive than the past ones we've been looking at, but nonetheless, this is a Prairie. Another kind of made of all work. Tended to be popular in areas, as you might have guessed, where they have prairie, where the land's really flat. You don't need a lot of power to scoot a train along, so these tended to be kind of freight and passenger engines. This is one of my more recent acquisitions. And those of you who might be familiar with British Railways have seen the little Great Western prairies. The tank engines they have, they're interesting little things. Big and small. They had bit technical, but they had big and small prairies. Not a very common wheel arrangement anymore, but it used to be a little more common around the turn of the 20th century. Yeah. 262 Prairie. Okay, next up we have a bit of an oddball this time around. This is a 264. known as the Adriatic type. A bit of a case of fantasy overcoming reality, because in reality, this was not a very common wheel arrangement at all, so far as contemporary research and so on tends to suggest there were none of these that worked in North America. But this is actually one of the more common wheel arrangements that you'll find in the world of toy trains and model trains, so much so that the alternate nickname of this wheel arrangement is the Lionel. Kind of not to get off topic for a second, but the reason is this is actually a reversed wheel arrangement that we'll be showing a little bit later, called a Pacific. And the reason they made this particular wheel arrangement, it was actually easier for it to get around sharp curves like you see right here. So they just flipped it around, and that's how we have the Adriatic. This particular Adriatic's kind of special to me because this was the first Lionel train I ever got. So it's always going to have a special place in the roundhouse. And I will say that even though North America we didn't use this, in Europe and the UK they had 264s. I believe the North Yorkshire Moors has got one of the BR standards tank engines that's a 264, so they were used elsewhere. But here in the States they're more ubiquitous in the tiny form than the real deal. So moving on. Okay, next up we have a very, very different sort of assortment of engines, but they all share a common theme. That's the next wheel arrangement we'll be discussing, which is the 460, called 10-wheeler. 6 plus 4 is 10. Kind of showing you one little reason we had the system of classification on wheel arrangement. See how very different these are. We've got kind of our bog standard modernized 19th century, maybe early 20th century 10-wheeler from the Southern Pacific. We've got a Camelback from the Jersey Central. Brief little bit about them is they got this big white firebox to burn anthracite, which burns a lot slower than regular bituminous coal. So they had to make the fireboxes so big that the fireman end of things was so huge that they put the cab up here. Very uncommon to see these anymore, but a lot more common in the days of steam. And we've got a British Great Western 10-wheeler. This one's been dressed up for the movies, for the Harry Potter series, but basically this is a Great Western haul. 10-wheelers are kind of maids of all work. Did freight and passengers, but on a Great Western, they kind of took the 10-wheeler to a high art. Their most powerful locomotives they had, the Kings, were 10-wheelers, which were basically enlarged versions of this. It's kind of how the Great Western did things. They found something that worked and just made it bigger. So if you've seen one Great Western 10-wheeler, you've pretty well seen the lot. They just get bigger and bigger, but the King is a very impressive engine. Yeah, that's the 10-wheeler. Okay, next up we have the 462, the Pacific. These two are streamlined Pacifics. And a little word on streamlining, it was basically a fad that happened in the 1930s to attract people back to railroad passenger travel when airlines and cars became a going proposition. Sometimes it had some aerodynamic benefits. Practically all modern trains, passenger trains, are streamlined to one degree or another, but for these it was largely cosmetic. Of note, the fastest steam locomotive in the world, officially, the Mallard, she's a streamlined 462 Pacific, an A4. That streamlining actually did some good on that, but it's kind of the exception to the rule. But anyway, as you might be able to tell, these engines are almost exclusively passenger engines. Now, that's not to say a Pacific never pulled a freight train ever. I've seen photographs of the K4s unstreamlined, which is basically the unstreamlined version of this, pulling freight trains, particularly when they got knocked off the passenger duties by bigger and stronger locomotives, to say nothing of diesels. Time marches on. To say they never pulled a freight train ever would be kind of a misnomer, but these are primarily passenger engines. Kind of like how I'm a sucker for 19th century brass and shiny trim, I kind of bit of a sucker for streamlining. Because even though it's a steam locomotive underneath, they still kind of look futuristic even today. Might do a little piece on streamlining if there's enough demand for it. But yeah, 462 Pacific. Moving on. Okay, next up, and rounding off the video on the 6-driver locomotives, we have kind of the ultimate evolution with the 464 Hudson style locomotive. These were kind of almost synonymous with the New York Central. And it's kind of an irony none of them got preserved, but that's kind of a different kettle of fish. Another engine which was almost exclusively a passenger locomotive, hauled the premier trains on just about any railroad they ran on. It's not to say you'd never catch one ever pulling a freight or a mail train ever, but these things were kind of reserved for the high creme de la creme of passenger service, at least until they got bumped down by stuff like the bigger locomotives. Oh yeah, they definitely get bigger. But kind of a funny little thing about these two locomotives, believe it or not, they're actually the same locomotive. Because this one looks like this one is what this one is underneath all the streamlining. Granted, there's a few little cosmetic differences. This one's got kind of a modeling thing of simplified valve gear and Baldwin spoke drivers, and this one's got Skellen. But believe it or not, that's a J-Series Hudson, and this is a J-Series Hudson, so kind of shows you the difference streamlining and without streamlining. I've actually got to see a Hudson, the aforementioned Transportation Museum up in Kirkwood near St. Louis has a Hudson, but it's not a New York Central Hudson, it's a nickel plate Hudson. Still a very impressive locomotive. And it was a real popular locomotive with model manufacturers, particularly Joshua Lionel Cowan. He was a big fan of the Hudson. That's why the famous 700E is a Hudson. Yeah. Up here on the shelves, got one more little Hudson. So I'm definitely a fan too. So yeah, I guess next time around, next video in the series, we'll be covering the 8-driver locomotives. And I should mention up front here, I don't have any 10-driver locomotives, so that'll probably be where we end out with the traditional locomotives, and then I'm going to do a little bit about articulated locomotives. But for now, as with the last video, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to put them down in the little box below. I'll answer you as quick as I can. Have a pleasant time until next time, tubers.